Perfectionists never finish anything. Non-perfectionists finish everything. What if perfectionism is actually the opposite of what you think it is? Everyone knows the perfectionist stereotype. They have impossibly high standards, they obsess over tiny details, and they produce flawless work when they finally complete something. This sounds logical because we see perfectionist tendencies in high achievers and assume that demanding excellence leads to excellent results. But there's something that doesn't quite add up. Why do most self-proclaimed perfectionists seem to accomplish less than people who claim they're not perfectionists at all? The perfectionism trap works by convincing people that impossibly high standards justify never producing anything at all. While non-perfectionists create and improve through iteration, perfectionists remain paralyzed by the gap between their vision and their current ability. If this kind of psychological self-sabotage disguised as quality control interests you, subscribe to Prof. John Explained and share this video with someone who's been perfecting the same project for months. They need to understand what's really happening to their productivity. The system creates two fundamentally different approaches to creation and achievement. When we say high standards, we mean totally different things depending on your psychological makeup. For actual producers, high standards means creating something, evaluating it honestly, and improving it through successive iterations. They understand that excellence emerges through the process of making, testing, and refining. For trapped perfectionists, high standards means refusing to create anything that isn't already perfect, which means refusing to create anything at all. They mistake paralysis for principle and inaction for integrity. Think about the last time you saw someone's work and admired its quality. Did they spend years perfecting it before showing anyone, or did they create, share, get feedback, and improve? This explains something curious about creative and professional achievement. The people who produce the highest quality work are often those who are comfortable with producing lower quality work initially. The difference isn't just about work ethic or talent. It creates fundamentally different relationships with the creative process itself. Producers see imperfection as information, perfectionists see imperfection as failure, but here's where it gets interesting. The perfectionism trap operates through three specific psychological mechanisms that masquerade as virtues while actually preventing any meaningful achievement. The first mechanism is what psychologists call all or nothing thinking. Perfectionists divide all possible outcomes into two categories, perfect or worthless. There's no middle ground where something can be good enough to share, learn from, or build upon. This binary thinking creates what we might call the impossibility filter. Every potential project or creative endeavor gets evaluated against an impossible standard. And since nothing can meet that standard initially, nothing ever gets started. Meanwhile, productive people operate with graduated standards. They understand that version 1 doesn't need to be as good as version 10, and that version 10 can't exist without version 1. The psychological function of all or nothing thinking is actually defensive. It protects the perfectionist self-image by ensuring they never produce anything that can be criticized or found lacking. But this protection comes at enormous cost. The perfectionist trades actual achievement for the fantasy of potential achievement, maintaining their self-image by never testing it against reality. The all or nothing mechanism also creates what we might call perfectionist procrastination. Since the current version of any project will inevitably fall short of perfection, there's always a reason to delay sharing or completing it. This procrastination differs from ordinary procrastination because it's driven by impossibly high standards rather than laziness or lack of interest. The perfectionist genuinely wants to create excellent work, but their definition of excellence makes creation psychologically impossible. Meanwhile, productive people practice what might be called strategic satisfaction, the ability to recognize when something is good enough for its current purpose, even if it could theoretically be improved further. This strategic satisfaction allows them to complete and share work that serves its intended function, then move on to the next project rather than getting trapped in endless refinement cycles. Do you find yourself starting projects with enthusiasm only to abandon them when they don't meet your initial vision? The second mechanism is preparation perpetuality. The belief that enough research, planning, and preparation will eliminate the need for messy trial and error learning. Perfectionists convince themselves they need to understand everything before they begin anything. They research exhaustively, create detailed plans, and search for the perfect system or methodology before taking any meaningful action. This mechanism appears productive because a perfectionist is always busy learning, planning, and preparing. They can point to extensive research and elaborate plans as evidence of their commitment to quality. But preparation perpetuality serves the same defensive function as all or nothing thinking. It delays the moment when the perfectionist must produce something that can be evaluated and potentially found inadequate. Meanwhile, producers understand that real learning happens through doing, not through preparation for doing. They gather enough information to begin, then learn and adjust through the process of creation. The psychological appeal of endless preparation is that it feels like progress while actually preventing progress. The perfectionist gets the satisfaction of working toward their goals without the vulnerability of actually pursuing them. But there's something even more insidious about this mechanism. It creates what we might call competence illusion, the belief that extensive theoretical knowledge equals practical ability. Perfectionists often know more about their field than producers do, at least in theory. They've read more books, studied more techniques, and understand more nuanced approaches to their craft. This knowledge becomes a trap because it raises their standards without providing the practical experience necessary to meet those standards. They know what excellent work looks like, but lack the skills that come only through producing imperfect work repeatedly. The preparation perpetuality mechanism also creates what psychologists call analysis paralysis. The more a perfectionist studies their intended field, the more complex and challenging it appears, making them feel less prepared rather than more prepared to begin. This is the opposite of what happens to producers, who typically become more confident as they learn more, understanding that knowledge plus practice equals competence. The perfectionist experiences the reverse dynamic. Knowledge minus practice equals increasing anxiety about their ability to meet their own impossibly high standards. Preparation perpetuality also exploits the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how much effort and time will be required to achieve desired outcomes. The perfectionist always feels like they're almost ready to begin, just needing to research one more technique, read one more book, or perfect one more element of their plan. This almost ready feeling keeps them perpetually on the verge of action without ever taking action, maintaining the illusion that they're making progress toward their goals. Have you ever spent more time researching how to do something than it would have taken to actually do it? The third mechanism is criticism catastrophizing, treating any feedback or imperfection as a fundamental judgment about personal worth rather than information about specific work. For perfectionists, criticism doesn't feel like guidance toward improvement. It feels like evidence of their fundamental inadequacy as a person. This makes the possibility of receiving feedback psychologically unbearable. Since any work product might receive criticism, the safest strategy is to avoid producing work products. The perfectionist protects themselves from potential criticism by ensuring there's nothing to criticize. This creates what psychologists call feedback avoidance, where the very information necessary for improvement becomes too threatening to seek or receive. Meanwhile, productive people develop what we might call criticism tolerance. They understand that feedback about their work is information about the work, not judgment about them as people. This allows them to seek feedback early and often, using criticism as a tool for improvement rather than experiencing it as a threat to their self-worth. But criticism catastrophizing goes deeper than just avoiding feedback. It shapes how perfectionists evaluate their own work internally. Since they experience any imperfection as a reflection of personal inadequacy, they become hypervigilant to flaws and weaknesses in anything they create. This internal criticism becomes so harsh that it prevents completion. The perfectionist looks at their work in progress and sees only what's wrong with it, never what's right or promising about it. This perspective makes continued effort feel pointless, because improvement never feels possible. Criticism catastrophizing also creates what we might call rejection sensitivity. The perfectionist becomes so attuned to potential negative responses that they preemptively withdraw from situations where criticism might occur. This sensitivity extends beyond direct feedback to include any form of evaluation or assessment. The perfectionists avoid sharing work, applying for opportunities, or putting themselves in situations where their output might be compared to others. The psychological function of this avoidance is to maintain the perfectionist's self-concept by preventing any evidence that might challenge their fantasy of eventual perfect performance. But this protection strategy has devastating consequences for skill development because improvement requires exposure to evaluation and comparison. How do you typically respond when someone offers feedback on your work as useful information or as personal criticism? These three mechanisms work together to create what we might call the perfectionist paradox. The pursuit of perfection prevents the creation of anything that could become perfect through iteration and improvement. The perfectionist remains trapped in a cycle where high standards justify low output, where concern for quality prevents any opportunity to develop quality, and where the desire to avoid mistakes prevents the learning that comes from making mistakes. But perhaps the most cruel aspect of the perfectionism trap is how it disguises itself as a virtue. Perfectionists genuinely believe they're demonstrating integrity, high standards, and respect for their craft. This moral dimension makes a trap particularly difficult to escape because abandoning perfectionism feels like abandoning principles rather than abandoning a dysfunctional psychological strategy. Society reinforces this moral interpretation by praising perfectionist tendencies and criticizing sloppy or careless work, not realizing that the alternative to perfectionist paralysis isn't carelessness, it's iterative improvement. The perfectionism trap also exploits what psychologists call the planning fallacy. Perfectionists consistently underestimate how long it will take to achieve their impossibly high standards, always believing that just a little more time will make the difference. This keeps them perpetually on the verge of beginning, always feeling like they're almost ready to start the real work. The gap between their current ability and their standards always feels like it's about to close, making the paralysis feel temporary rather than structural. Meanwhile, productive people understand that the gap between current ability and desired outcomes closes through action, not through planning or preparation. But there's another layer that makes perfectionism particularly destructive. It creates what we might call opportunity cost blindness, the inability to see what you're not creating while you're perfecting what you're not sharing. While the perfectionist works on making their first project perfect, productive people are on their 10th project, having learned from the previous 9. The perfectionist's theoretical first project might be better than the producer's actual first project, but it will never be better than the producer's 10th project. This compounds over time. The perfectionist falls further behind, not because they lack talent or knowledge, but because they lack the practical experience that comes from completing and sharing imperfect work. The perfectionism trap also creates what we might call skill development paradox. The perfectionist wants to develop expertise, but avoids the very activities that create expertise, namely producing work that can be evaluated and improved. Expertise develops through cycles of creation, feedback, and refinement. Each cycle improves both the specific work and the creator's general skills. The perfectionist breaks this cycle by refusing to complete the first step. The result is that perfectionists often plateau at the level of theoretical knowledge without developing the practical skills that come from applying that knowledge repeatedly in real situations. The perfectionism trap ultimately works because it offers a seductive bargain. You can maintain the fantasy of being capable of perfect work by never producing work that reveals your current limitations. This bargain appeals to people who are more invested in the identity of being excellent than in the process of becoming excellent. It allows them to feel superior to people who produce imperfect work while never risking the vulnerability of creation. But the fantasy eventually becomes a prison. The longer someone avoids producing anything, the more pressure they feel to make their eventual output extraordinary, which makes starting even more difficult. The system perpetuates itself because perfectionist paralysis looks noble and principled, while iterative improvement can look hasty or careless to outside observers who don't understand the process. Educational and professional environments often reinforce perfectionist tendencies by penalizing mistakes more heavily than they reward learning, making the perfectionist strategy appear rational even though it prevents the very learning that leads to expertise. But there's yet another dimension that makes the perfectionism trap particularly insidious. It creates what we might call comparative perfectionism, where the perfectionist compares their internal experience to other people's external results. The perfectionist sees someone else's polished final product and imagines that person must have some special talent or advantage that allows them to create quality work effortlessly. They don't see the messy process, the multiple drafts, the failures and revisions that preceded the polished result. This comparison reinforces the perfectionist's belief that they need to be able to produce polished results immediately, rather than understanding that all polished results emerge from initially unpolished attempts. Can you think of anyone who became excellent at their craft by waiting until they could do it perfectly before they started? The perfectionism trap also creates what we might call version lock. The perfectionist becomes so invested in making their current version perfect that they can't move on to the next version, even when the next version would benefit from lessons learned from completing the current version. This version lock prevents the iterative improvement that actually leads to high quality outcomes. Instead of creating version 1.0, getting feedback, and improving to version 2.0, the perfectionist remains stuck, trying to make version 1.0 into version 10.0 without the intermediate learning. The psychological appeal of version lock is that it feels like dedication and thoroughness, when actually it prevents the completion that enables real improvement. Meanwhile, productive people practice what might be called version progression, the disciplined practice of completing each version to the best of their current ability, then applying what they learned to the next version. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the perfectionism trap is how it exploits the confusion between standards and perfectionism. High standards are about creating excellent work through disciplined effort and continuous improvement. Perfectionism is about avoiding the discomfort of imperfection by avoiding creation entirely. These are not just different in degree, they're different in kind, leading to completely opposite outcomes. People with genuine high standards produce more work, not less, because they understand that excellence emerges through the process of making, evaluating, and improving. They're comfortable with imperfection as a temporary state on the path to quality. Perfectionists produce less work because they're unwilling to experience the temporary discomfort of creating something imperfect, even though this discomfort is the necessary price of eventual excellence. The perfectionism trap has successfully convinced millions of people that their paralysis demonstrates integrity rather than fear, that their inaction reflects high standards rather than low tolerance for discomfort. Meanwhile, the people creating excellent work understand that perfection is not a starting point, but a destination reached through the disciplined practice of beginning before you're ready and improving through iteration. The perfectionism trap also creates what we might call temporal displacement, the belief that perfect work can be created at some future point when conditions are ideal, knowledge is complete, and skill is fully developed. This temporal displacement allows the perfectionist to maintain their commitment to excellence while indefinitely postponing the actions that would lead to excellence. They're always preparing for the perfect moment to begin, not realizing that the perfect moment is created by beginning imperfectly. Meanwhile, productive people understand that the ideal conditions for creation are created through the process of creation itself. Skills develop through practice, not through waiting for skills to develop. The perfectionism trap ultimately succeeds by converting the natural desire for quality into a mechanism that prevents quality from ever being achieved, ensuring that the perfectionist remains trapped in the gap between aspiration and action. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the perfectionism trap is that it prevents people from discovering their actual capabilities. The perfectionist remains forever uncertain about what they could achieve because they never fully commit to achieving it. The fear of imperfection becomes a greater obstacle to excellence than imperfection itself, creating a psychological prison where the desire to avoid failure guarantees failure to achieve meaningful success. The perfectionism trap represents one of the most successful mechanisms for converting natural ambition into paralysis, ensuring that those capable of creating excellent work never discover their capabilities because they remain forever preparing to demonstrate them. Hit subscribe if you want more analysis of how psychological patterns disguised as virtues actually prevent achievement, and share this with someone who's been perfecting their approach instead of practicing their craft.